Hello, welcome to week 7 of Pioneering Through a Pandemic. Uh, my name is Joe Sullivan, and I'm going to be speaking with you for a few minutes before we get to Matt Young, who is going to be speaking on historical perspectives on the coronavirus. And so the first thing I thought interesting. Okay. Oh, there we go. Good. So the first thing, and really the main thing I'm here to do is to remind everybody that we do have a project related to this course that you'll be writing and submitting on Moodle via Turnitin. And that paper is due July 24th. So I'm going to be speaking for a few minutes. If you have questions about this project essay, feel free to type them in chat right now. Dr. Walker is also here, and so after I kind of get through my preliminary remarks, we can answer those questions that you have. Also, if you have questions during the week, feel free to email Dr. Walker or myself, and we will be happy to answer them. Just as a reminder, here's the gist of the assignment. We've been speaking for 7 weeks, including today, about the coronavirus pandemic. You've heard people speak from a wide variety of disciplines all across our campus. And what this assignment is asking you to do is to draw connections between the different things you've learned about pandemics and about the coronavirus from these different disciplines. And so I'm not going to entirely go back through the prompt. The prompt is on the Moodle page, near the top of the Moodle page, and so I just encourage you to read it again. Essentially, you're going to either do a 3-4 page essay, or you're going to do a project like a collage. If you do some kind of audiovisual project, you're still going to have to write a short reflective essay. Those details are on the prompt. In any case, what I would recommend is that you pick maybe 3 or 4 of the weeks that really kind of struck you, and try to incorporate what you've learned from those different weeks, both from the lectures from our faculty members who shared their time with us, and also from the readings that they posted. In many cases, there were also readings along with it. And those videos are all still up on Moodle. So if you want to talk about what Dr. Splatro spoke at the beginning of the class, you can go back and rewatch that video. So so I think that was basically it about it. Like I said, feel free to send in some questions if you want us to answer them before Dr. Young speaks today. I mentioned I had some preliminary remarks, and they all have to do with one of the alumni of Marietta College, Dr. Richard Krause. And he exemplifies a liberal education and the benefits of a liberal education. I would see I'm going to cough. And he graduated in 1947. His father and uncle were both very well-known faculty members at the school, who during their careers helped shepherd the school during challenging times. So he comes from a family very dedicated to Marietta College. While he was here, he studied mathematics, he studied the various sciences, he really enjoyed studying history, and he was also a fan of studying literature. He served in World War II in the Army. He went to Case Western Reserve University's medical school. He served in a number of different offices. The NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health, one of those institutes is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He worked there and actually led that lab for a number of years, and that's what I'll be talking about him for a minute. And he was also Dean of Medicine at Emory University, their medical school. So he was just a really, really accomplished person. I posted on the Moodle page for tonight a chapter from a book that he published in 1981, and that book was called The Restless Tide. And the reason why I thought this would be interesting is, first of all, it's a book about infectious disease, but he wrote it in a way that drew upon his entire liberal education. So it is a history book. And again, Richard Krause was a medical doctor, but he wrote a history book that was based on a series of public lectures that he gave, right? So drawing upon communication skills. He did it because he saw that there was a political case that needed to be made to try to shape the priorities of our nation. And of course, at the heart of it all was very serious, nuanced, sophisticated scientific issues that he was an expert in, right? So him drawing upon all of these different disciplines that he studied as an undergraduate at Marietta College, it kind of put him into a position, unique position, to be able to affect change. This is a quote about this book, which, like I said, was based on a number of lectures he gave. Richard Krause was among the first scientists in the modern era to sound a clarion call about the persistent threat of infectious diseases, and during his leadership, he kept scientists and policymakers focused on the concepts of emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases. That is from the person who succeeded him as the leader of that lab. His name's Anthony Fauci, and you may have heard of him. He has been in the news of late, right? And so what had happened is that apparently science had been so successful in dealing with certain diseases like smallpox and polio and others, that people felt like there wasn't really a need to go into that anymore and to devote resources to it. In fact, in one of the articles that Dr. Young posted, the author, Charles Mann, writes, "When I was in college in the 1970s, medical students were actually discouraged from studying infectious disease because it was thought to be just really dull and unnecessary, really." And Richard Krause was one of the people who indicated, like, no, this is not over, right? And certainly he was correct. This is a quote from the chapter that I posted for you near the end of that chapter, where he is trying to essentially, he was trying to convince the general public and policymakers that we needed to devote more money in research to infectious disease, and that it would be worth doing. And of course, if you read the whole chapter, he talks about some of the, and if you read the whole book, he talks about some of the challenges of infectious disease research, and why some things are easy fixes and why other things are not easy fixes. And yet he was saying that, we have to do this now. And he was optimistic. And he said, well, why was he optimistic? Is because all of the advances that he had observed that were made in science, right? And so he was buoyed by those advances, and yet he felt a need that we needed to kind of recommit to them. The very end of that chapter, I wanted to mention a couple other things. Again, I'm an English teacher, so all of this stuff is way outside of my area of familiarity. And yet, as I mentioned before, he studied math, he studied history, he studied sciences, obviously, and he loved Shakespeare. I'm a Shakespeare teacher. And the last thing in the chapter, he quotes from Shakespeare. So you might recognize this paragraph if you read that bit. He said, "We must meet the restless tide, and in Shakespeare's words, take the current when it serves." That's actually from Julius Caesar, Act 4, Scene 3, And if you read Julius Caesar in high school, many of you probably did, you'll know that it is a very political play. And if you think today's Senate is dysfunctional, you know, they got one for you that matches that. And this quote, that line comes from Brutus speaking to Cassius. They've already assassinated, not a spoiler, but they've already assassinated Julius Caesar at this point. And now they're trying to decide what, you know, what should they do, what should be the next course of action. And the whole quote is, we at the height are ready to decline, meaning that we're at the height of our power right now. There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune, meaning like right now we are at the height of our power. And if we take advantage of this opportunity, then we can do something. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries, meaning that if we miss this opportunity, if we miss this window of time that we can do something, nothing we can do will matter. On such a full sea, we are now afloat. We must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures, right? So he was drawing from this very political play to say that people have to act when it's time to act. Now, of course, I don't know if Brutus is like the best person to take advice from, but you know, that we can still glean advice. And that this is a picture of Dr. Krause. He said, "I firmly believe in the value of the Bachelor of Arts. It's essential preparation for a medical career. All of you who are interested in the sciences, in a sense, the human condition in all of its aspects, in sickness and in health, is the domain of medicine." And so if you're an English major who's coming here, I hope you study the sciences and the social sciences. If you're a social scientist, we hope that you study the humanities and the arts. You can learn a lot by doing these various things. So I'm going to stop my screen share. I didn't know, Dr. Walker, if there were any questions we wanted to hit before. Let's see here. Would you like us to use a standard 5-paragraph structure? Okay, so now what I understand the 5-paragraph structure to mean is that it has an overt beginning, an introductory paragraph, some kind of body that is laid out in that introduction, and then a conclusion which reiterates the main points. I think that's not a bad, if you're doing the essay option, right, then I think that that's fine. So if you're comfortable in a 5-paragraph theme format, that would be a successful strategy for it. If you're not, like, I don't know what that is, don't feel pressured to do it. I think you'd be fine responding however seems organic to you. And feel free to contact us if you have any questions. I'll be sure to, you know, or Dr. Walker will be sure to get back to you. How do you feel about the history of the blood plague in an old War of Warcraft, and how it is studied, and how it relates? Now, actually, Dr. Young is going to speak about the plague tonight. I don't know if that's the blood plague. Is that the same thing, Matt? Is the blood plague that you're going to be speaking about?
I don't think so.
Now, the War of Warcraft,
I'm not sure.
is that the video game War of Warcraft?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah,
we can come back to that one.
Yeah, we'll come back to it. I have to admit, the last video game I played was called Super Pong, and it was essentially 2 little lines and a dot between them. So, but I have grown children that play those things, and I mean, engage in those things. I don't want to, you know, say play, but yeah. So we'll have to see about what Dr. Matt thinks about that. Is there a specific format? No, okay, so this was something Dr. Walker and I did speak about before tonight. You do not, they mentioned the MLA or the APA format. You do not have to use a particular style format. If you really want to, you will not be, points will not be deducted because you formatted it in MLA or APA or anything like this. But it's not necessary for you to. I would say if you're mentioning the title of something, just you know, put the title in italics or question marks. If you're going to quote verbatim from something, put in quotation marks, and that should really be all you have to do for this assignment. Obviously, when you get to school this fall, almost all of your instructors are going to ask that you use a format. But so thank you for asking that. It's something that we should address before. You don't have to worry about formatting it. Were the creative activities mentioned last week also part of the assignment prompt? Yes, that's option 2 on the assignment prompt. So you'll notice the prompt has 2 options. It's option 2 is the one that I'm referring to there. And are we supposed to include answers to the 3 questions you had on the first screen? I derived those questions from the prompt. So basically those, what I have on my slide tonight are paraphrases of the directions given in the prompt. So if you answer those questions, if it made best sense to you from that PowerPoint slide, you can respond to that way, or if it makes best sense to you just working from the prompt, you can respond that way. You do not have a works cited page required. Again, if you include one, don't have to take it off. You won't be penalized for it, but we're not requiring a format for this assignment. I think that is all of them. But please do continue to, you can continue to send comments in or questions in, and we will obviously be happy to clarify instructions for you. With that, I'm going to send it over to Dr. Young, who is going to be speaking with you tonight about the history of pandemics. And I'm not sure how to, do I just shut up and then the camera goes off me, or I think I'll turn off my camera.
Okay, that works. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Let me share my screen. I have some slides that I want to use to accompany my talk. So yeah, I'm Dr. Matthew Young. I'm in the history department at Marietta. I teach a wide range of courses. I'll talk a little bit about my history and film course in the fall that I'll be teaching. But my main focus, my area is modern American history, the 20th century. And so that's sort of interest in the 1930s, the interwar period from World War I through World War II. So at Marietta, I teach a course in World War II. I teach recent American history. So this is sort of a natural topic for me to begin thinking about, specifically about pandemics in American history. And so hopefully what I'd like to do is put some context, kind of where we are at this moment in a larger historical frame. So I did, just because of the nature of this session, I'm not doing what I typically do in class. I have really written out my my presentation. So let me just get started with that, and I'll kind of tell you how we're going to work things tonight. So my aim is to summarize a broad topic, how the history of pandemics shed light on our current experience with the coronavirus. As of today, there are almost 13 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 globally, a quarter of which are here in the United States. The death toll here now is around 135,000 and is projected to exceed 200,000 by the end of the year. And this is a unique moment in our country's history. It's a time of great anxiety and uncertainty, but the study of history is often a helpful corrective in that we know that this country has survived other times of crisis and anxiety in the past, and that gives us some reason for hope and some assurance. But I chose the Atlantic article by Charles Mann, Pandemics Leave Us Forever Altered, because he points out a central paradox. The experience of pandemics in the more recent past, and in particular the 1918 influenza pandemic, which I'll be talking about rather extensively, that they don't occupy much space in our collective memory. We have a tendency to forget these events ever happened, which that in turn suggests we really don't rely on them much for our recent experience for guidance. We're not looking to our history for any kind of guidance or lessons that might have to teach us. And I believe to our own detriment. Let me just show you an example of what I mean. I'll start sharing my screen. Oop, I'm at the end of my presentation. I'll go back to the beginning. There we go. All right, so then this shows us a chart of life expectancy in the United States since 1850. We can see very clearly here this upward trend of life expectancy, except for one serious anomaly. And so this is the impact of the 1918 influenza epidemic. It had that kind of devastating impact on life expectancy. The epidemic killed almost 700,000 Americans. Half of the 100,000 Americans who died in the First World War, half of that number actually died of the flu, the other half of battle deaths. So this is a major event, yet most Americans are completely unaware of it, at least until the present, when again, it's become relevant. The same goes for other pandemics in the 20th century. There's a kind of collective amnesia here, which I believe helps to explain why the United States hasn't dealt with the current COVID pandemic very well. So I'm going to cover a few topics tonight. If we don't use history, or at least our recent history as a guide, then how do we think about pandemics? Before I move on, let me just really quickly here touch on what I mean when I use the term pandemic. I'm kind of throwing that around a lot. There isn't really a precise kind of clinical definition of the term pandemic. Pandemic is usually defined as a worldwide epidemic, a disease that spreads rapidly and simultaneously in multiple regions, affecting a large proportion of the population. So my focus tonight will be on infectious diseases that spread globally in a very short amount of time, essentially pandemics that mimic what the coronavirus has done in the past 6 months. So because of this particular focus, I won't deal, for example, with the global AIDS pandemic, even though it's obviously a significant event and has had a significant impact on American society. So that, just to let you know sort of how we're going to work things here, I'll welcome any questions that you have. Just post to the chat or the Q&A or whatever you are accustomed to doing. I think maybe the best way of approaching this, I have about 45-minute talk prepared. It's very content heavy, so I think it might be nice that it has a natural break in the middle. So about midway through, we'll stop. If you've got some questions, post them and I'll answer them as best I can. And then I'll do the second half of the presentation and answer any further questions that you have at the end. I'll also add that I've posted a couple of the research articles that I've used for this presentation. The PDFs are on the Moodle website. So if you're interested in getting into it a little bit more, you're free to, I would invite you to do that. So Charles Mann, other historians argue that more distant pandemics occupy a primary place in our thinking. More specifically, when we think about pandemics, we tend to think of the Black Death or smallpox, and I'll provide brief overviews of these. I'll argue that as scary as these were, and I'm going to call them the big bad pandemics of the past, they don't really help us in thinking about pandemics today. I'll also argue that popular culture plays a significant role as well. Fictional accounts, I'm talking novels, TV, film. Even though we don't like to admit it, these have a pretty powerful influence on the way that we think about reality. And then, that'll be the sort of the first half. Second half, then I will focus on major pandemics in American history, and with a particular focus on the 1918 influenza pandemic. Hopefully here for obvious reasons. So, first, popular culture. I would say that popular culture tends to occupy the vacuum in our collective memory where history leaves off. Films and books like The Andromeda Strain, The Stand, Contagion, World War Z, 12 Monkeys, and Outbreak, that's just to name a few, This is the movie ad for Contagion, which came out a few years ago, shape the way that we think about infectious outbreaks. Historian Nancy Tomez points out, popular culture has taught us to, quote, fear the microbe, but in ways that I don't believe to be necessarily healthy or useful. Movie microbes tend to be really, really nasty. They melt your insides, turn you into a zombie. Those microbes threaten to destroy the fabric of civilization, or even worse, usher in the apocalypse. Right, and so we know the sort of the disease subset of the natural disaster genre. You're probably pretty familiar with its rather predictable outline. Movie microbes have exotic origins in some distant jungle. They're developed in a lab, or maybe some combination of the two, before they go rogue and wreak havoc. Often there's a shadowy government conspiracy with villains who are bureaucrats, right? They're always easy to dislike, with dark motives. Matt Damon, we see Brad Pitt, Will Smith, sometimes a combination of that group, play an outsized role in leading a team of scientists who generally happen to be not only brilliant but also attractive, to find a cure, working tirelessly in a lab until the vaccine is developed to save civilization or whatever's left of it in less than 150 minutes. I think it's important to touch on this based on my own research on history and film, because I believe the power of visual culture, especially in the last century, has had a profound impact on the way we see the world and our expectations of reality. Beyond that, it creates fertile ground for conspiracy theories to take root. It heightens apocalyptic anxieties in that the pandemic threatens to, or sometimes does, destroy civilization. And finally, popular culture reinforces faith in science and medical technology, which always seems to come through at just the right moment with the cure. In short, popular culture tends to simplify and dramatize pandemics in ways that bear little resemblance to reality. So that's that. I'm going off my soapbox here. And so now we can start talking history. Let's look at the big bad pandemics of the past. Let's talk about real historical events. As Mann points out, those devastating pandemics in the more distant past tend to occupy a larger space in our collective memory than recent ones. So I'll touch on just three briefly. I could talk about a lot of them, but I'm just going to look at sort of, in my mind, sort of the big three: the Black Death, smallpox, and cholera. The Black Death. Texts from various world cultures describe different sorts of plagues. The term plague is derived from Greek and Latin words that mean blow or stroke, which makes sense given their propensity to come out of nowhere and devastate a community and bring an empire to its knees. The Black Death, and we see painting here, the mid-14th century, killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. Many populations did not reach their pre-plague levels until the 19th century. So it's almost 500 years. Many European societies struggled to repopulate themselves. So as you can imagine, it left an indelible mark on those cultures that viewed it as a harbinger of the apocalypse. And here we see a very common Black Death image of the era, the death, right, on a pale a horse riding through and striking down victims. People at the time generally viewed this as the harbinger of the apocalypse, the beginning of the end times. Most experts assume that this was the bubonic plague, or possibly some combination of plagues, pneumonic, septicemic plagues are possible contenders. Some maintain that this was altogether different, possibly a hemorrhagic fever related to Ebola. This is the trouble with sorting out the history of infectious diseases, because they change over time and they become very difficult to diagnose centuries after the fact. Current research is still going on. In fact, testing the victims buried in plague pits in Europe to identify the pathogenic agent that was responsible. So the bacterium that causes bubonic plague was actually discovered in 1894, along with the fact that it was carried by flea-infested rats. This had been theorized and then was finally proved. This knowledge turned out to be particularly helpful in San Francisco after the 1906 earthquake, as an outbreak among Chinese immigrants there led city officials to, quote, wage a war on the rats, which helped to limit the spread, but, of course, which also served to reinforce anti-Chinese prejudices among the white population. The very phrase, waging war on the rats, could be interpreted at least two ways, right, by those living in San Francisco at the time, either referring to actual rats or possibly to the Chinese. This highlights an important social response to pandemics in general, where they have a tendency to fuel pre-existing fears. And so scapegoating the poor, foreigners, other marginalized groups is a common feature. Another good example of this was the perception of AIDS when it emerged in the United States in the early 1980s and was oftentimes referred to as the, quote, gay disease. So bubonic plague today is endemic. It's become ubiquitous in many parts of the world, including the Western United States, where there are still a handful of cases each year. As long as the plague is diagnosed early, in its early stages, it responds very well to a range of antibiotics, and so is fairly easily treatable. Don't play with marmots. That's my advice to you tonight. And if you want some practical advice, don't play with marmots, and you have nothing to worry about. So it's one of my favorite memes. If you haven't seen that video of this little screaming marmot, you can Google it after my talk. So smallpox, big bad pandemic number 2. The history of smallpox also illustrates the ways that infectious diseases evolve over time. Smallpox was endemic in the old world, and descriptions of it can be found in the text of any ancient civilization. You look at Egypt all the way to China, and you'll see smallpox is present. But it's not until sometime in the 16th century, 200 years after the Black Death, that smallpox evolves into a truly lethal killer. Those who survived the disease were generally permanently scarred, but it was understood that this conferred immunity. And so while upper-class men and women sought to hide their disfigurement as best they could, for the lower classes, smallpox scars sometimes an asset, because advertisements for servants might mention that they needed to be able to prove that they had already had smallpox in the, quote, natural way. So if they'd survived the disease, then it was an asset. Of course, smallpox is best known for its terrible impacts on the New World, whose populations had never been exposed to the disease in any form. So we see this image here of a Native American suffering the effects of this disease. After its arrival, as a consequence of European contact, its impacts were even more devastating than the Black Death had been in Europe, with estimates ranging between 2/3 and even 9/10 of the native population were killed of this disease because they had no resistance to it. By the late 18th century, British doctor Edward Jenner discovered that those who had been infected with cowpox, which is a related disease, were immune. So this effective method, which became known as vaccination, which is derived from the Latin term for cow, or vacca, had a significant advantage over inoculation. In inoculation, you inoculate a patient, you actually introduce a small amount of the live virus. The advantage of vaccination was you then had a much milder case, a much milder reaction, and you still conferred immunity, whereas in some cases, if you weren't inoculated properly, you could actually die. I mean, you were actually exposed to a live smallpox virus. So the practice of vaccination had been refined by the end of the American Revolution so that the effects of smallpox here in the United States were blunted as the country expanded westward. By the mid-1960s, an improved vaccine enabled the elimination of the disease in most of the developed world. And at about that time, the World Health Organization launched an ambitious program to eliminate the disease entirely in the developing world as well, which was also successful. The last documented case of smallpox in the developing world was in Somalia in 1977. And then a few years later, the WHO declared smallpox completely eradicated, and there has not been a case since. 2 labs in the world, the CDC in Atlanta and a Russian government lab in Siberia, still possess the live virus. Notice that when Dr. Sullivan mentioned the restless tide then, this is part of the timing of Krause's book, in that he's trying to make the argument that this is just the moment when the victory over smallpox had been declared. This was a terrible scourge, a terrible killer, and had now been eliminated. And Krause is trying to make the argument to policymakers and to the public alike that we shouldn't let our guard down. Just because this terrible disease had been eradicated didn't mean that we could now celebrate and not worry about it. Not worry about smallpox or any other infectious disease. So the final big one I want to talk about is cholera. We move forward a little bit to the 18th and 19th centuries. This is the Industrial Revolution and industrialization spreading around the planet, global trade networks linking imperial centers to their colonial possessions around the world. This brought with it more pandemic challenges. We should think about this time in world history as a first global age, as peoples from a wide range of different places moved and mixed, gathering in rapidly growing cities that were hubs of vast trade networks that reached every corner of the planet. So under these conditions, cholera is just one example of many microbes that hit the proverbial jackpot, where it only needed opportunity to enter a host's intestinal tract to multiply rapidly, setting into motion a deadly sequence of events that almost inevitably led to that host's death. Try not to make this too unpleasant. I know many of you just finished eating dinner, but cholera bacteria act as if to squeeze its victim like a sponge, causing him or her to expel water until the victim is dead, and thus spreading more bacteria and increasing the chances that it will then be ingested by another potential host. In a particularly virulent outbreak, which you see pictured here in this 19th century British print, a person could feel just a little off after dinner and then be dead less than 24 hours later, making this disease particularly feared. It arrived first in Germany via trade routes from India in the early 19th century, finding plenty of hosts in the filthy living conditions in Europe's crowded cities, and quickly spread throughout Europe and North America. But at the same time, the very problem a disease like cholera could exploit led to the tools to defeat it. Imperialism, industrialization enabled the disease to spread, but related developments at the same time led to the scientific discoveries that identified the culprits of many microbial sources of infection, as well as methods of effective treatment. I've mentioned bubonic plague, but other diseases, typhoid, tuberculosis, syphilis, were all identified about this time in the late 19th century. These discoveries were being made. Cholera was discovered in 1883 by a team led by the German Robert Koch. The Robert Koch Institute, which is sort of the German version of our CDC, it's named after him. And what Koch did was prove that cholera had a microbial source. It wasn't caused by bad smell. It wasn't caused by atmospheric or weather disturbances, as some thought at that time, but there was an actual biological source here, a microbial agent. Cholera, as it turns out then, can be treated fairly easily and effectively and cheaply with an infusion of intravenous fluids. You diagnose the disease quick enough and intervene, get that person on an IV, keep them hydrated, and what was once the most feared scourge of densely crowded cities is now practically unheard of. In fact, it is unheard of in the developed world and in the developing world as well. You get the occasional cholera outbreak, but it doesn't happen very often, thankfully, these days, with modern sewage and water treatment systems. So just to sum up here, kind of touched on these sort of big bad pandemics. Today, we think about them and think about them fearfully, but at the same time, some of these diseases have largely been eradicated. Others we have effective treatments for. Yet at the same time, they still occupy take up a lot of space here in our collective memory when we think about infectious disease. So that's kind of the first half of my presentation. Let me stop here briefly and kind of give everybody a break. And if you've got some questions, let me take a look and see here. I'd be happy to answer some. I see one. Oh, I see.
Yeah, I don't see any questions at the moment.
Well, I just see the one about, we have a follow-up question about that World of Warcraft
yeah.
pandemic.
So
I'll have to take a look at it. I don't know the game very well. I'll have to take a look at it.
Very interesting. There was I had a chance to take a quick look, and it's one of the things that's great about teaching college is that we learn from each other.
Yeah.
And actually, Jackie's absolutely right. There are researchers at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville who have been able to take what happened in the World of Warcraft pandemic in 2005, and it's helped them in terms of being able to model behavior of people in pandemics. And I know modeling is something that you're interested in.
Sure.
Yeah, that's jump in real quick. When Dr. Young and I were teaching,
I can hear Joe. Hey, I don't think your mic's on.
Oh, sorry. When we were teaching a class last year together, we found this game called Plague Inc.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And apparently that's like one of the major popular video games these days. And it's about a pandemic. And apparently it's banned in some countries where they have particularly high, censorship of news and things like this, because people were using this video game as a way to kind of I guess report and disseminate information.
Wow. Okay.
So if people are interested in a video game related to this type of thing, I think the most popular one is called Plague Inc. I think that's the one, and I've messed around with it a little bit, but I'm not adept at it. So back to you, Dr. Young.
Okay. Well, I'll just pick up then on the second half now, pivot and I'll talk exclusively now about the American experience and specifically about 20th century, 21st century pandemics in the United States. Normally, when I'm teaching history, I sort of start at the beginning and work my way forward toward the present. But actually, what I'm going to do this time, if you'll indulge me, is going to switch things around. I'll start with the more recent past and work my way backward, because as I said, it's most important that we spend some time looking at the 1918 influenza pandemic because of the lessons that it has I think, to teach us in the present. So let me just, let me do that then. All of these pandemics actually happen to be influenza outbreaks. I won't comment on that more than just to say they are kind of all tied together. So we'll start actually in very recent memory. I'm sure, you know, most of us, certainly those of us here teaching this class, remember the 2009 swine flu pandemic resulted in 13,000 deaths in the United States. It's an H1N1 virus actually related to the swine flu that caused the 1918 pandemic. Approximately a fifth of the American population contracted the flu, yet again, the death toll was very, very low, less than 13,000 died. It was determined to have transferred from pigs to humans somewhere along the Mexican-American border, where human-to-human transmission began from there, and then it spread quickly throughout both countries and then around the world. Again, not particularly deadly, but one of the interesting aspects of it was 80% of those deaths occurred in people under 65. Which bore a disturbing resemblance to the 1918 epidemic, which I'll talk about. An effective vaccine was distributed toward the end of the year. Here we see President Obama himself being vaccinated, although there were considerable controversies surrounding delays in its production and distribution. So there were issues there and things to think about as we think about the distribution of a potential coronavirus vaccine. That was 2009. Working our way back, we go back to 1968. The Hong Kong flu killed around 100,000 Americans. Here we see this billboard that was put up at the time. Hong Kong flu is un-American. Catch something made in the USA. I think this was sort of an attempt at a little bit of humor. Yet at the same time, we see this sort of undercurrent, I think, anti-Asian, anti-Chinese sentiment here. The 68 Hong Kong flu had evolved from the next one I'll talk about, the 1957 strain. It developed in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and sickened American forces that were fighting in Vietnam. And returning troops brought it back to the United States in December of 1968. Now,
I'm going to interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
If we're not seeing your slides, if you have slides that you want for us to see.
Shoot,
Go back
you missed some good ones. Thank you for,
so,
I thought I had my screen
back.
sharing on, but thank you for telling me.
Absolutely.
Go back. Now, can you see it? We good?
Yes.
Suzanne?
We can see it.
Okay,
yes,
good.
that's perfect. Thanks.
So there's President Obama getting his vaccine. There's the Hong Kong flu is un-American billboard. I like that advice. If you're going to get sick, catch something that originated here. So yes, so the 1968 Hong Kong flu, as I said, 100,000 deaths. A vaccine was developed later in the year. Actually, it came out in August. The vaccine was distributed at the same time that the Woodstock Music Festival was taking place. And this made a considerable difference in dealing with the second wave of the flu. This illustrates the point that I'm trying to get at here as well. When we talk about pandemics, you know, when I say Woodstock, it probably conjures up images in all of our minds, right? We're all kind of familiar with that event. When I talk about the Hong Kong flu pandemic, which happened at the same time, I'm sure that means nothing to most of us. The virus sickened a lot of Americans. Actually, President Johnson himself came down with it. As you said, it killed about 100,000 Americans. This pandemic illustrates something important about the problematic nature of making predictions about viruses. As I said, came in two waves. In the United States, the first wave was far deadlier than the second. The second was very mild. However, in Europe, it was the opposite was true. The first wave was very mild, while the second wave was quite deadly, and it's sort of unpredictable. All right, so now I can move on. The 1957 Asian flu now, 116,000 deaths. Like the 1968 flu, this one also traveled to the United States via military personnel. The other important thing I want to mention about this is it was after this pandemic that the CDC initiated its first comprehensive nationwide vaccination program. So it was after the Asian flu that people started to get vaccinated. So that brings me then to sort of kind of our main event here, the 1918 flu, the most significant of these pandemics. Often referred to as the Spanish flu, as I said before, had killed almost 675,000 Americans. Despite the name, it's generally agreed that it started in the American Midwest, somewhere likely in Kansas, in the spring of 1918. The country was in the midst of mobilizing for World War I, which incidentally explains how it ended up being called the Spanish flu. Spain was neutral in the war, so its press freely reported on the disease, while military censorship rules meant that the combatant nations kept its spread among their militaries a closely guarded secret. The timing of this outbreak could not have been worse. This was kind of like cholera in a sense, where the microbe hit the jackpot because the disease jumped from pigs to humans just at a point when millions of young Americans were being shipped around the country and across the Atlantic to fight in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson received early reports of a deadly outbreak, but chose not to interrupt the mobilization plans underway, and that decision undoubtedly contributed to its rapid spread. The first wave subsided in the summer, but then came back with a vengeance in the fall. So by October of 1918, almost 200,000 Americans had died. Ultimately, that number would reach almost 700,000 by that final wave, when it ultimately subsided and disappeared in the summer of 1919. So almost as mysteriously as it arrived, it also sort of somewhat mysteriously disappeared. Worldwide estimates vary considerably, but range between 20 and 100 million dead, making this event worse in terms of the total death toll than the Black Death. Particularly hard hit were younger people in the 20 to 40 age group. Like some COVID deaths, it was believed that this was due to what we call the cytokine storm, an excessively robust immune response that made the victim susceptible to a secondary infection. So not only the influenza, but the fluid that filled your lungs then made you susceptible to pneumonia. So many died of that. Another factor in the high death rate was the fact that so many medical personnel nurses and doctors had been drawn into the military, and so they were not available to civilians at the time. This is a particularly deadly virus. So many young people died within days of becoming infected. It had a significant impact on life expectancy, which you've already seen, but it also had long-term effects on survivors. It created health problems for those who survived into the, through the rest of their lives, as well as unborn children whose mothers had contracted the virus. Those who were born then, as I think Charles Mann points out in his article, those individuals also had health problems as they grew up, which is another thing to think about with the coronavirus as well, that what are its long-term effects? We really have no idea. So what was the response? What was the response? I want to make a couple of points here. The causal factor of the influenza in 1918 was not understood. Viruses as a class of organisms had not been identified. But it was understood that whatever was causing this influenza, and they called it the X germ, it's a term I kind of like, the X germ spread through the air as well as on shared objects. So they knew how it spread. Now it's very important here to appreciate that this is a generation that had been brought up dealing with another dreaded airborne disease, tuberculosis. And so the strategies that have been employed to slow the spread of TB were very quickly adapted to use against this new deadly flu strain. But now think about this, the public health toolbox in 1918 is pretty much identical to the one that we've got now with COVID. I'm going to talk a lot about NPI, non-pharmaceutical intervention. Non-pharmaceutical intervention, what you know as social distancing, mask wearing, contact tracing, quarantining. These were the methods that Americans understood from earlier efforts with tuberculosis, and so then they were quickly employed by health departments around the country. So overall, the 1918 flu initiated the most drastic, comprehensive public health response in American history, at least up to the point where we are right now. So the second wave started in New England, actually in an army barracks near Boston, in the fall of 1918, and it quickly spread around the Northeast. So imagine that the first wave starts in Kansas, spreads east, around the world. Second wave in the United States starts in the Northeast and spreads to the West. In the cities in the Northeast that were hit first, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, in those cities, the illness and death rates rose so fast that authorities felt they had no choice but to impose sweeping public gathering bans, shut everything down. They closed churches, schools, theaters, everywhere they could, but it was really too late. Those measures were taken too late to really deal with the spread. It spread very quickly. However, leaders of other cities with more time to prepare were able to effectively use some of those strategies. So this is where this graphic, I'm sure many of you have seen this already, this famous flattening the curve graphic that contrasts Philadelphia and St. Louis. This is where that comes from. The difference between the two cities is a matter of timing. Philadelphia is hit first with the disease, as you can see, right? First case in September, social distancing started in early October, but by that point it's too late. The disease spikes in Philadelphia. But now, with about a month to prepare, St. Louis authorities imposed social distancing, NPI, right, that non-pharmaceutical intervention. They imposed that immediately after diagnosing that first case, And you can see the longer term impact that it has, and flattens that curve in St. Louis. So its experience, its mortality rate was far lower. Throughout the country, health officials faced the same dilemmas then as they do now. Controlling fear and hysteria was a problem. The public was confused. They saw a mixed message they were getting from authorities. On the one hand, authorities were telling them, don't panic. But then at the same time, they were implementing never before seen restrictive measures. That indicates something significant was happening, some significant threat. Obviously, there was something serious to be afraid of. But so how afraid should they be? Again, this is 1918. This is an era of newspaper media. That's how people got their news. This is a pre-radio era. And the newspapers often tended toward exaggeration to sell papers. Editors fully exploited the dictum, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so then it wasn't as if people could necessarily trust the media, the story that the media were telling them. One way that the 1918 pandemic is different from other pandemics in history was that specific racial and ethnic groups were not scapegoated, right? We talked about some examples in the past that didn't happen in 1918. And really the reason for this, most people think, is because it spread so quickly. It spread so quickly from city to city. Within a place, it spread quickly among different groups, among different classes of people. And so it was almost, it happened so fast, there was no one that you could really effectively blame. Never pinned on a particular group. So the officials and the public were then divided in many ways that mirror what we see happening today. Experts fought with each other over the most effective response. They knew how the disease was transmitted. So how do we stop it from spreading? You had those who favored a complete shutdown, a complete quarantine. That was going to be effective, but other people pointed out that was impractical and impossible. And so they instead focused on appealing to individual citizens to uphold the collective good, make it the citizens' responsibility to do the right thing. Business owners and the public fought over what services were deemed, quote, essential, what should stay open, and what was non-essential, what should be shut down. What I find very interesting is that the debates centered less over closing churches. Churches and schools were closed everywhere. But there was a lot of debate about movie theaters, which might seem strange to us, but at the time, it can be an indication. Movies were a relatively new technology at the time, but they had really become very powerful, very important source of entertainment for people. And so, you know, none of the public experts disputed going to the theater if you were sick was a bad idea, but at the same time, they're trying to balance the fact that movies provided essential entertainment for people. And when everything else had been limited or closed, that, you know, many thought that movies were really kind of essential, kind of an essential outlet. In most cities, theaters were closed because of the threat they posed, but theater owners pushed back, pointing out that other not quote unquote non-essential businesses were allowed to remain open. One of their favorite targets were five and dime stores, right? They weren't essential for anyone. No one had to buy groceries there, but they were allowed to stay open. And so theater owners argued that they should, that the same rules should apply to them. In New Orleans, city leaders closed down the churches, but left all the stores open, prompting protests from Catholic priests. Among the public themselves, I think the divides will also seem familiar, especially a split between urban and rural populations. Closing movie theaters made sense maybe in the big city where there were lots of cases and lots of people, but didn't make so much sense in a rural town. And in 1918, most Americans do live in small towns and in rural places. So oftentimes they found themselves, like in a town like Marietta, probably resistant to whatever kinds of state ordinances were being imposed. In the end, compromises were often struck that the business could remain open and avoid stricter control if they agreed to play an active role in compelling individuals to take responsibility. Here's a, oop, there we go. So a public service announcement from the 1918 influenza, which sounds very appropriate today. We could adapt this right now, I would think here. Redirecting one's cough, sneezing in handkerchiefs, mask wearing in public were all strategies that public health authorities pushed. And these were usually enforced with criminal charges or fines for those who failed to comply. In all major cities, anyone who coughed or sneezed in public without a handkerchief was liable for arrest. As a general rule, as I'll point out below, these measures were followed, although there were notable exceptions. Plenty of people resist the idea of having to wear a mask in 1918. One of the prominent cases is the actual commissioner of health in San Francisco, who was fined for not wearing his mask at a boxing match. So what are the lessons learned from this effort? As I said, the 1918 flu prompts the most far-reaching public health response in American history, really up to the present moment. It led to advances in public education and outreach, as well as methods of contact tracing and quarantine. A second large outbreak, 10 years later, right before the Depression, provided the opportunity to implement methods learned. Now, what's really interesting here is that colleges were used as an important testing ground of these refined methods. So in the 1928-29 outbreak, the University of Oregon limited the spread of flu to 15% of its student body by quickly quarantining the victims that lived in dormitories. Recent research has shown the economies of cities that implemented NPI, right, social distancing, masks, the whole bit, that implemented those measures early on rebounded more quickly. And this is one of the articles I've included if you're interested. But I basically, this graph kind of tells the whole story here. Let me point out a few things. First, you got blue dots and red dots, right? Cities that implemented stricter policies, as you can see, tended to have lower mortality, right? So they tend to be clustered down on this end of this mortality axis than cities that had more lenient policies, right? So that it gives you a sense that this NPI, these interventions, worked. But second, cities that implemented stricter NPI saw more significant increases in employment after the second major wave ended in 1919. So what this axis shows us here is the increase in employment comparing 1914, before the pandemic, and 1919, after the second wave of the pandemic had subsided. One thing we notice is that we have a tendency here to see sort of more blue dots on the upper end of the scale. At the bottom, right, we can see, you know, plenty of blue and red dots clustered together. And what that tends to suggest, or what these researchers determined from this, is that at the very least, if strict non-pharmaceutical intervention didn't lead to great economic growth, it certainly didn't hurt. It didn't cost that city much. The economic costs were minimal. I think there's a very important lesson here in this graph that we should be learning right now and applying in our own cases. The other thing I want to point out is that we can see a kind of regional trend here. The red dots that generally followed more lenient policies tended to be clustered in the Northeast. These were the cities that experienced that second wave first, and where we see more blue dots, the stricter policies with the lower mortality tended to be Midwestern or Western cities. Obviously there are exceptions, but we can see some general trends there. Again, suggesting that those cities that took action when they saw the virus beginning to spread actually successfully lowered their mortality rate. So finally, did we learn anything from earlier pandemics now that we're dealing with one right now? My guess is, if you've been listening to my presentation, you know what I'm going to say. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that way. It doesn't seem like we've learned much from our recent past. A few months ago, when we were all watching the number of cases level out, number of deaths in decline, I was cautiously optimistic, I think with many people. But this recent spike, even as other countries seem to have gotten their cases under control, it's clear that the United States is not managing this very well. I'd, in fact, even go further to argue that we aren't managing COVID as well as the 1918 flu outbreak. Without a vaccine, NPI is the only way to handle this sort of public health emergency. And past experience has shown it can be effective in minimizing, even halting spread. Many places in the country, we started out strong, but there hasn't been the continued will to employ strategies that have been demonstrated to be effective, which is why we're seeing a spike right now. Now, overall, the death toll from COVID will be considerably less than the 1918 pandemic, which is a good thing. But it's impossible, at this point at least, it's impossible to compare the severity of the two diseases at this point. Remember, in 1918, there were no antibiotics to treat common secondary pneumonia infections, and that, of course, would have considerably reduced the death toll in 1918. But what I'm really getting at here is a willingness to get behind a sustained effort to employ non-pharmaceutical interventions. Remember, again, in 1918, Americans didn't have the internet, couldn't binge Netflix or Hulu to get them through. Their one entertainment outlet, the movie theater, was shut down. They're stuck at home, cut off from social outlets, cut off from church, school, etc. This would have been a very, as you can imagine, right, a very trying time. It lasted almost 2 years. But the research shows that most Americans complied. Case numbers declined. And by the summer of 1919, sort of late at that time, the virus began to disappear. So I guess the last question, or the last couple of statements I'll make as I wrap up, you know, are Americans in 2020 different than Americans were in 1918? And that's one of the things I think what I'm going to do is sort of mostly push this off on you all. I think you've got your discussion groups, and that's one of the questions I pose that I think would be good for you to wrestle with. How have we changed in terms of, you know, our sense of individual responsibility, our sense of collective responsibility? You know, Americans in 1918 openly questioned the effectiveness of wearing masks. Many people refused to wear masks. But the vast majority of people did. Another difference I think that's important to point out is that Americans in 1918 had much more direct experience with the devastating effects of infectious diseases than Americans do now. How many times have I heard people dismiss COVID as, quote, just the flu? And I just wonder if, to me, all that means is that person's never actually had the flu. Anyone who suffered the effects of the flu isn't going to just sort of brush it off as no big deal. It's a serious illness. But Americans in 1918, you know, very likely knew someone who had died of an infectious disease, had certainly knew many people, and who had themselves suffered the effects of a whole range of different infectious diseases. So I think, as I mentioned, sort of historian Nancy Thomas at the beginning, talking about how popular culture has taught us to fear the microbe, I can't help but wonder if Americans in 1918 had a healthier, more realistic appreciation for what that fear meant. So the last thing I'll do, and I promise I'll wrap up here in a minute, is just to leave you with the metaphor taken from Robert Krause's book that Dr. Sullivan mentioned at the beginning, the restless tide. The metaphor of the threat of the microbial world as a restless tide, I think, is just a very helpful way of thinking about it. I think coming out of this, and I want to remind everyone, there will be an end to this. It's a question of when. We need to think seriously about finally putting resources to dealing with the inevitable increased risk of pandemics in the 21st century. Krause had incredible foresight. He wrote a book 40 years ago that we have yet to really fully take seriously and implement some of his insight. Think about the 21st century. It means more people, more pigs, increasing environmental degradation. All that does is just simply increase the likelihood of more pandemics from happening. Talking about tides makes me think of water control projects in the Netherlands, and that's what this image shows, where the majority of the land area in the Netherlands is actually under sea level. So the Dutch are right there on the ocean, but most of their country is under sea level. Historically, then, they have become masters at keeping the sea at bay. And I think that's very helpful in thinking about this, in giving us a metaphor to think about this. We need to think about microbes in the same way, developing medical technology to manage crises, but beyond that, to develop the community mindset that's essential in public health. We need to understand that our own individual health depends upon that of our neighbors, and that when they're not healthy, we all suffer. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Young. We have a couple questions, but I do want to let our folks know we're at time, so if you need to go, please feel free to. We'll keep recording so that you can go back to the recording and listen to the answers if you want, but if Dr. Young is willing to hang out.
I'll stick around if people want to, yeah.
Okay. So
thanks for hanging in there, everybody.
The first question is, how is COVID-19 different from past pandemics aside from the virus itself? In other words, what are the different societal, cultural effects, if any, it has caused?
Well, I mean, I think that's part of what I was trying to get at there at the end. And in a way, it's too soon to tell. I mean, as long as this last few months has seemed to us, we have a ways to go yet, and so that I would say it's sort of too soon to decide. At the same time, I think, again, we've seen that, we saw the number of cases go up and then begin to decline and then spike a second time, so that, Dr. Fauci recently said we're sort of kind of hip deep in the middle of the first wave. We haven't even gotten through that. So to me, that suggests that there's a kind of unwillingness among the public to really employ the measures for a variety of reasons. But I think that, we see that at least at this point. And who knows? I mean, hopefully, people can change their attitude, their perspective.
Hey, can I mention something real quick, Dr. Young and Suzanne, Dr. Walker?
Oh, yeah.
Having to do about the societal effects. In my comments about Richard Krause, I failed to mention the fact that he was the head of this lab at the advent of the AIDS crisis, mm-hmm. and that he and Fauci both made great advances, but they also were heavily criticized, you know, because of the speed of research or the slowness of research, however you want to look at it. And some of that had to do with perceptions across society that AIDS was a problem, but not for me. You know what I mean? There were particular populations
Sure.
that were in danger, and the general public didn't think of it. And I did see this very early in this pandemic. We all remember all those articles about, well, the elderly might get it, but they've had a good run. You know what I mean? And then actually seeing newspaper articles about like, hey, I'm 60. When did I become expendable? You know what I mean? And so, so there is this sense of, you know, as public priorities are made about like, well, is this a danger for whom, and to what degree do we care? You know what I mean? And so in that way, I think there are similarities in pandemics as it tests our valuation of who we perceive to be the victims of those pandemics.
Mm-hmm.
Back when you were talking about the Spanish flu, Dr. Young, and talked about the fact that it was called the Spanish flu because they were who were reporting on it, a student asked, isn't that kind of the opposite now? The rest of the world is freely reporting on COVID while China is trying to keep it under wraps.
I suppose. I mean, yeah, I think that's trying to kind of work that through here. I mean, I think that the fact that it's, I'm not entirely sure how the term Spanish flu actually stuck. I think it was just sort of convenient for the various nations involved in the war to let them take the blame. You know, yeah, and as far as, you know, media freedom to report on the actual spread, I mean, that the conditions, I guess I would say, are different. I mean, wartime Europe, under a, you know, very strict kind of set of censorship rules, whereas obviously China's government is strictly controlled and highly centralized, and the press doesn't have, you know, freedom to report under normal circumstances. So, I mean, I think that is definitely a limiting factor, at least was at the early stages of this. You know, by the time it began to spread outside, you see to me what's interesting, or I guess to me what's more interesting, is that it's not like, I don't think anyone expected the Chinese media to give us an accurate portrayal of what was going on. I mean, I think that was just assumed. But then once the virus begins to spread to other countries, how those countries responded very differently, I think that is where, you know, we really see some of the significant differences in the efficacy of their responses, their public health infrastructure, public attitudes, and those kinds of things.
We have a question from Aditya that I think we're going to leave as a teaser for next week. I know Dr. Spilotro is listening tonight. And Dr. Spilotro, the question is, has there ever been a pandemic agent that went through an evolution to a different kind of pandemic agent before vaccine development of the first vaccine ever happened? And so I think I'll let you answer that next week, because I know you're going to be talking about vaccines. And then it looks like Natalie has one last question.
Thank you, because there's no way I could answer that question.
I know, but since we have the scientists listening tonight,
I was going to push it off onto Steve anyway. Yeah, good.
We'd give it to him. And then Natalie asked, do you think Americans' attitudes towards the virus reflects our attitudes about the elderly? If so, why do you think Americans seem to not care about older people like other cultures do? Mm-hmm. And when did this cultural shift start?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Wow. Well, I mean, again, you know, think about, you know, this differs from what I was talking about earlier, in that there's a tendency in pandemics sort of blame particular groups for, you know, bringing the disease or somehow creating the disease. I mean, we see that now, fingers being pointed at China, for example. But then the idea that somehow, like Dr. Sullivan were saying, that there are populations that are somehow expendable, like, you know, who cares, that if you know, the elderly are going to die in large numbers. That's a tough question to answer in any kind of succinct way, except to say that I would trace it back to, you know, I would go back all the way practically to the end of the Second World War, where you begin to see, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, increased mobility around the country. And then, you know, one of the factors there was that large numbers of retired people. I mean, the idea of retirement itself is sort of, again, a post-war phenomenon. So we begin to see this population grow, again, as the society itself gets older, as we get grayer as a population. And so then we have seen, and I think we just continue to see this trend where groups of people in this country become compartmentalized according not just to age, but socioeconomic class, race, political affiliation, religion. And this is a phenomenon in my geography class. We talk about this guy. It's called the big sort. This as Americans have become more affluent and more mobile, they have a tendency to become more, again, isolated. And I do think that helps to create an atmosphere where you might not encounter many elderly people, or you might not have that kind of direct relationship with your elderly relatives that earlier generations did. And I think then that simply creates an environment where it becomes easier to just, you know, shrug your shoulders at and say, well, maybe, you know, maybe they are somehow expendable.
All right, I think we're done. Thank you.
All right.
Dr. Young and Dr. Sullivan for another very interesting evening. And folks, as Dr. Sullivan said, if you have questions about your papers this week, you have my email, Dr. Walker, and you have Dr. Sullivan's email as well. Don't be afraid to email us, and we'll be happy to give you some feedback. Otherwise, have a great evening, and we'll see you next week for the last one.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.